Okay, so let's try to start our last but not least plenary of this IA Congress. I'm Kunni from South Korea, Seoul National University. You know, the topic today is about past and future of dollars, which is one of the most important topics in contemporary economics. And it will be discussed by one of the best experts on this issue, Helen Ray, a professor of economics at London Business School. And most importantly, she will be the president of this IEA in 6 years. Okay, after 3 with Eric Maskin, another 3 with Wendy Carlin. I know this because I'm also a member of the executive committee of this Congress. You know, her research has transformed our understanding of global financial system by proposing the concept of a global financial cycle and also discussing the limitation of the concept of Mendelian trilemma. I know he has a book, he has an article, highly cited, more than 4,000, about this title. Title is Dilemma, not Trilemma. So maybe she will also talk about these issues. Okay. Today, Helen will present exorbitant privilege and exorbitant duty. Her lecture will be basically about cost and benefit of dollars as the world's leading reserve currencies. You know, the U.S. has some benefit of financial advantage because dollar is what every country wants. But in exchange, U.S. has provided the role of the world's last insurer during crisis. So I guess her lecture today will explore how dollar's global dominance create both benefit and some duties in the same time. Let's please welcome Professor Helen Ray with a big applause. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for these kind words of introduction. I'm very grateful and very honored and happy to be here with you today to discuss this topic. And as was mentioned, very glad to join the International Economic Association also as future president. So it's a big topic that I'm going to be discussing with you today, and I will leave a bit of time at the end for questions, if you have any. It's a topic on which I've been working for a very long time, in particular with Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas here, who is a co-author of this paper, and obviously nothing I'm going to say today represents what the IMF has to say. He's still the chief economist of the IMF for I think a few days now, before going back to academia. And it's also joint work with Michele and Andreoli from Boston College. So what are we interested in this paper? We are interested about how we can explain and build effectively a structural model of the international monetary system that is going to be able to speak to 5 important facts on the US and the structure of the international financial system. Why is it important? You know, we started this work, as I will mention, very long time ago, in fact, in 2010. But why is it a very important topic today is because we are all aware that we see very big potential changes in the structure of the international financial system these days, whether it is because of geopolitics or whether it is because of a rise of cryptocurrencies and changes in technologies, in payment system. And so it's worth asking ourselves, what's really the structure? So can we think a bit structurally about the international monetary and financial system? Because if there are big changes, then in order to anticipate, expect these changes, do some policy maybe work, we do need to have some structural idea of how things work. So this is what it is all about. So I'm going to focus on the explanation or some attempt of explaining 5 fundamental things. One is the fact that the US essentially has a World Banker balance sheet, and I will explain what I mean. The second one is about exorbitant privilege, which is a very French thing. And I will again explain where it comes from and what we actually mean by that from a quantitative perspective. And then I'm going to discuss the fact that exorbitant privilege is really the counterpart of also an exorbitant duty in crisis times. And I'm going to talk about the real appreciation of the dollar during a global crisis. This is linked to the safe haven property of the dollar. And I'm going to see also how everything fits in terms of the movements in the safe real rate in the world economy. So it's a bit of a tall order here, but I'm going to try to link these things. So the literature is enormous. As I said, we have still been working on the paper. We still haven't fully finalized the draft since 2010, with, in particular with Pierre-Olivier Gourenchas. And so this relates to an enormous and very distinguished literature on the international monetary and financial system, with financial historians, with people having been working on the exorbitant privilege also for a while. There are lots of models which are very different kind in the literature. This relates also to the literature on asset trade. This relates on various more recent attempts to discuss the similar issues, some building on our paper on exorbitant privilege and exorbitant duty. Okay, so we also, interestingly, have some newcomers in the literature, which comes to the fact that, its geopolitical issues are becoming more and more important in the world economy, and so maybe it's not, therefore, a coincidence that we have two members of the US Council of Economic Advisors who recently have worked on this type of issues. So Pierre Yared on global hegemony and exorbitant privilege with Caroline Pfluger. And also we had Stephen Miran contributing some thoughts on restructuring the global trading system and linking it also to the financial system. So the terms of exorbitant privilege, so it's really privilege exorbitant because it comes from the philosophy of Charles de Gaulle. The General de Gaulle was the president of France and then was picked up by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, his French finance minister, back in the 1960s. So we are talking Bretton Woods here. We are talking under Bretton Woods. And the way I think de Gaulle was thinking about these issues is very much exemplified by this quote here, which is, de Gaulle was thinking that the US had really a unilateral facility about issuing a medium of exchange because everybody wanted the dollar as a medium of exchange in the world economy. Remember the post-war period, dollar was very important to do international trade, and this was post-war reconstruction, so you really needed dollar, everybody needed dollar. But that was not what he calls an impartial means of international exchange. It was also a means of issuing credit for one state. And what he meant is that because everybody wanted dollar, right, you could issue dollar that were taken by everyone, and the US could use this dollar to actually buy valuable assets, which were in particular companies in Europe at the time. So effectively, because you were issuing the medium of exchange that everybody needed, you could use this to cheaply refinance to buy companies, Western European companies in particular at the time. And so this created some resentment in the French leadership at the time. And that was viewed as really an exorbitant privilege. Right? And that's what it was, right, to some extent. So now Steve Miran, in his kind of now famous paper of 2024, has a kind of different view about the fact that the US is issuing this international currency. And for him, he emphasizes more what he sees as a burden, the fact that when you issue the dollar as an international currency, sure, that might decrease a little bit your financing cost, but that also imposes some cost on you, in particular, that might make you non-competitive. So you have to balance the two things. So this appreciation of the dollar, he doesn't see that as an advantage. He doesn't see the financing cost of the US as being very low as a tremendous advantage. And so there was really a kind of emphasis on the cost there. And I will discuss that more, but for us, we will compare these benefits and costs under the guise of this exorbitant privilege, exorbitant duty paradigm that I'm going to be discussing in more detail. So the exorbitant privilege, that was the de Gaulle thing. I can issue a liquid currency that everybody wants, that's the dollar, and use it to buy valuable assets, okay? So how do we quantify that? Well, that's exactly what we quantified with Pierre-Olivier back in 2007 in 2 papers, which are quoted here, and it was about computing effectively the return on the gross external asset position of the US compared to the return on the liability position, the external liability position of the US. So the liability is the financing side, so you pay low interest on that side, and the return on the asset position, if you buy very productive company in Europe, you get high return. So if you have an excess return, that's exactly what that's a quantification of the exorbitant privilege of the goal. Okay, so that's what we have been doing, and I will give you an update on that. And effectively, what you do see in the data is this World Banker balance sheet. You issue safe liquid assets, like a banker would issue deposits. People like to have money deposits that are very, very handy to do transactions. And then on the asset side, bankers invest in, we make loans, they invest in risky assets, and they make the excess return, right? So this is very similar. That's a World Banker balance sheet. Now, having an excess return on external assets compared to external liability, that gives you an advantage from the point of view of the intertemporal budget constraint of a country. It relaxes this intertemporal budget constraint, so it makes sustainability easier from the point of view of external accounts. That's the exorbitant privilege. Now, what is the exorbitant duty in our view, in our model and in our setup here, and also in the data, I will argue, is that if you have a balance sheet, an external balance sheet, which is the one of a banker. So on the liability side, you have a lot of safe dollar liabilities. On the asset side, you have a lot of assets denominated in other currencies. In global crisis times, what is happening to your liability and to your asset? The liabilities, they go up in value or they stay constant because the dollar goes up in value, and the US treasuries, which are a lot in this side of the balance sheet, if anything, also they go up in value or they stay constant. They are the safe assets. That's the reserve currency role of the US treasuries. So the liability side, if anything, goes up. On the asset side, on the other hand, risky assets in global crisis time, they tend to collapse, right? And other currencies also tend to depreciate vis-à-vis the dollar. So both the exchange rate and the risk premium here makes this asset side collapse. So if you think about it, that means your assets collapse, your liability goes up. That's a wealth transfer from the US to the rest of the world. This is the duty, this is the insurance transfer that the issuer of the world reserve currency provides to the rest of the world. So if you are a world banker, you have an exorbitant privilege. In normal time, you have excess return on your assets compared to your liability. But in global crisis time, you insure the rest of the world. That's kind of, your job in a way. And so you have this negative wealth transfer. That's the duty. So this view of the international financial system is a bit like, an insurance view. The World Banker is providing insurance to the rest of the world. And then when you think about it this way, the exorbitant privilege makes sense. That's kind of an insurance fee. And the exorbitant duty, that's kind of the insurance payment. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. That puts the two things together. So this is pretty much what we are going to discuss in our theoretical framework. And I'm going to be motivating this by showing you quite a bit of data that we have worked on for quite a long time. So we constructed over time this balance sheet of the US. And I'm going to show you that what I've just said is compatible with the data. And I will draw then a few conclusions from the model. So let's go to the empirical side of things. So when you want to discuss this issue, obviously the first thing you have to do is to construct the banker's balance sheet. So to construct the external balance sheet of the US at market value. And that's not as easy as it looks at first sight, especially if you want to go back to post-World War II, which is when the US became at the center of the international monetary system. Because effectively, to do that, you need to rely on two data sources. One are the surveys that are very infrequent and that are about the position of US residents in the rest of the world and these positions are at market value, and same thing, so it's the US resident invested in the rest of the world, and the rest of the world investing in the US. That's at market value, but that's very infrequent, especially post-war, immediately post-war. And then you have to rely on balance of payment data, which are the flows, the capital flows between residents and non-residents, but these things are not at market value. And so the two have to be, by an accounting identity, they have to be related. So you have to construct the time series of the balance sheets. We do that for quarterly data, and we have an update up to 2025 Q4. Now it has become a lot easier in the recent period, because when we started with Pierre-Olivier, the BA was not actually providing this type of data, and survey were relatively infrequent, and then they became much more frequent over the years. But for the recent year, for the very old years, the one during the Second World War, what is interesting is that, in fact, the US did a very good job in 1941 and 1943 because these were strategic data at the time. So these very early surveys were actually very good because people really wanted to know where assets of Germany was and liabilities, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So this is the methodology to construct the data. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but you see that when you have the positions, you want the position at market value. You need also the flow, which are not at market value, which are at face value. You need to add some valuation term, and then there's a reconciliation term. Okay, so when we do that, we end up constructing the external balance sheet of the US as a percentage of US GDP, from 1950 till 2025. And so here, this is going to be the asset position of the US. And so I'm going to say a few things on this. First of all, you see that up till the 1980s and even more the 1990s, these gross positions are not that big as a percentage of GDP. This is pre-financial globalization, and after that, we have a lot of financial globalization. So suddenly, the cross-border position grew up a lot. Secondly, you see that they are disaggregated, these positions, in terms of types of assets. So we have, for example, here, the green is going to be the foreign direct investment. So this would be the US investors buying Japanese firms or European firms. That would be foreign direct investment from the US. And here, the purple one, portfolio equity, that would be the US residents buying English equity, for example, or anything outside the United States. So that's what we are discussing here. You can see that what is pretty striking is that on the asset side, we do have a lot of green and a lot of purple here, right? So these two components are very big. These are risky assets. And on the other hand, the debt component, which is in red, is not that big, right? And then we have banks, which are the light blue. So that's for the asset side. How about the liability position side? It looks very different. Well, first of all, it's way bigger in terms of percentage of GDP. We are above 200% of GDP here. But also, if you look at the color composition, which means the different type of asset composition, so we look at these two components here, government debt and corporate debt. It's a lot bigger than the red component, which was all of the debt that we had on the asset side. So there's an asymmetry. There's a lot more debt on the liability side than on the asset side, okay, and in particular, a lot of government debt. And up till a recent period, it was also very clear that the equity and direct investment were a lot smaller on the liability side than on the asset side. But these days, we see that there has been quite a lot of growth in portfolio equity investment in the US. In particular, this is due to the extreme valuation of the US stock market, right? But still, we have this asymmetry where you can see that on the liability side, you have more debt, essentially, and on the asset side, you have more risky assets. So that's, this world banker characteristic that I discussed. It comes together with dollar on the liability side, everything being issued more or less in dollar, while on the asset side, these portfolio equities and this foreign direct investment, it's a bunch of currencies. Can be yen, can be euros, can be a lot of stuff. Okay. Right, so when we take the difference between these two theories, gross assets minus gross liabilities, you end up having a US net foreign asset position, which looks like the dark line. And you see that as a fraction of US GDP, we are now somewhere towards minus 90% of US GDP. So there has been a very substantial deterioration of the US net foreign asset position, right? It's now the net position. For comparison, I put the cumulated current account as the red line here. And you see that for a big part of the sample, the current account was below, the cumulated current account was below. That means that valuations effect on the US net foreign asset position were helping the US, were stabilizing the net foreign asset position, while in the recent period, it's the opposite. So that means in the recent period, actually the valuation effects are kind of worse for the US in terms of external sustainability. Okay? And this is, why is that? Well, a lot of the explanation has to do with the outperformance of the US equity market. We have a lot of equity liabilities in the US, which are held by the rest of the world. The US equity market outperforms a lot in the recent years. This means the liability side increases a lot, actually, and you can see it in the graph here. Whether this is a permanent state of affairs or it will be reversed, I mean, we don't know. Okay, so now I think some more data, because I think this one is also very, very telling. If now I take the same data, but I'm going to construct the net by class of assets. So I'm taking gross debt assets minus gross debt liabilities. I'm taking FDI assets minus liabilities. I'm taking equity asset minus liabilities, okay? And all on the external side. I think it's very, very striking what we see. So until a relatively recent time, you see that we have a bunch of net positions here, which are FDI, equity, and even banks, which are positive. So that means on the asset side, there's more equity than on the liability side. There's more FDI on the asset side than the liability side, etc. However, you also see that on the debt side, there's a lot more liability than asset. So the net debt has gone down massively to minus 40% of US GDP here, and is still there, essentially. And in the very recent period, what happened is exactly what I was discussing before, which is that now also the net equity position has come negative. Okay, and this is due to the fact that the US stock market has outperformed stock markets in the rest of the world, and also that a lot more foreign investors have bought the US equity, right? So, and you can see it from foreign direct investment. So now you see that even on the risky asset side in the recent years, actually we are negative, but we are still, and I think it's very important for financial stability point of view, people who are interested in that, we are still in a very negative net debt position for the US. So that means there's a huge stock of US treasuries which are held abroad, essentially. That's what it means. Okay. So asymmetric balance sheet, leverage, you can see it's a very leveraged balance sheet. We've just shown that with a debt, and asymmetric both in terms of types of assets and currency denomination. Okay, so that's, I think we definitely covered the first stylized facts here, and let me give you just the numbers for the exorbitant privilege on the whole sample. So the exorbitant privilege on the whole sample, I would use the assumption, so depending on how you construct exactly the data, you can get different numbers. I think the most reasonable numbers are in panel C here, where we find that the excess return on assets over liabilities on the 1952-2025, almost 2026 sample, is about 2.8% real per year. So 2.8% excess return per year is not a small number, right? And that's the exorbitant privilege. All right. Now, what happened to the exorbitant privilege, this excess return over time? This is also something we can look at, and that we have done. We have done that. So here it is. Here is what it looks like. The excess return, it's been smoothed a little bit because this is extremely volatile. And you can see that it's mostly positive. On average, it's with 2.8% in real terms. However, you can also see probably that there is a trend there This exorbitant privilege is declining over time. I mean, we clearly see this, right? It's declining, and in the recent period, it's negative. Right? So there is definitely an erosion of this exorbitant privilege in the data. All right, so that's the exorbitant privilege in the data. That was the World Banker balance sheet. So now, what about this exorbitant duty thing that I explained? It's this insurance transfer in bad states of the world. Because the risky side of your balance sheet collapses, the liability goes up, you are doing this NELF transfer. Can we see it? Yes, we can see it. And for that, we can see it in several places. But the most dramatic one is obviously the global financial crisis. So everybody remember 2007, 2009, and in particular 2008, in the middle, Lehman Brothers crash. Lehman Brothers crash, that's a great financial crisis. During that period, the net foreign asset position of the US drops by a very large amount. It's about 2.7 trillion. And that's about 14% of US GDP in valuation loss. So essentially, this wealth transfer is about 14% of US GDP. Where do we see it in the graph? Well, in the graph, we see it here. You see that in 2008, Lehman Brothers, there's a cliff going down here for the net foreign asset position of the US. That's a 14% decline in US GDP, roughly. That's a wealth transfer, the deterioration of the US net foreign asset position. If we move forward, there are other cliffs. Some are linked to the euro area crisis. Some are linked to the COVID. Some are linked to the invasion of Ukraine. And then there's other stuff, obviously, which are different. But each time we have a big global crisis, we tend to see this deterioration of the net foreign asset position of the US. If we can see it at even higher frequency, if we just plot here the detrended US net foreign asset position, the valuation component of the US net foreign asset position, and we plot it together with the VIX, which is an index of stress in global financial markets. And you can see that when the VIX goes up, which means its financial markets are very stressed, this is where we see, so this is the 2008, you see the VIX going up massively. That was a very unusual peak for the VIX at the time. You see the net foreign asset position going down massively. And again, when we see periods of stress in financial markets, again here this would be the euro area crisis, this would be COVID, this would be the invasion of Ukraine, we tend to see also a decline in the net foreign asset position, which means the wealth transfer, okay? But at higher frequency, we see this negative correlation. It's there, right? Okay, so because this transfer happens at times of crisis, this means times where the marginal utility of consumption is high, this is how we can really interpret this as an insurance payment and the exorbitant privilege as an insurance premium. So now you could ask, so do we actually really see a real transfer during this time, right? More on top of these valuation changes, this wealth transfer? And the answer is yes. So if you look at, again, let's take a look at 2008, which is the biggest shock in the whole sample here. You see 2008, you see the trade balance here of 2008. So the trade balance is in deficit, has been in deficit for the US for quite a while. And the scale of the trade balance, don't be fooled here, is very different from, it's here, it's very different from the scale of the net foreign asset position as a percentage of GDP. But you can see that the trade deficit decreased massively at the time of a crisis, so consistent with the transfer of the US to the rest of the world. Current account surplus, that's transfer, right? Okay, so now, how are we going to model that? Is the question. So the model, I'm going to be very quick on the model, but you can actually look at it in the paper for those of you who are interested. The main thing to understand about the model is the basic building block, which is how do we model this kind of world banker who is insuring the world. And the way we think about that is we are going to take a world in which the US is essentially a more risk-taking entity than the rest of the world. So why would the US be a more risk-taking entity? Well, maybe that's cultural, but maybe more realistically, or I don't know if it's more realistic or not, but that's linked to the fact that US financial markets might be more efficient on average than the rest of the world. So if you have models in which markets are less incomplete within a country, like the US compared to the rest of the world, you can show that in reduced form, it ends up looking like the US is more risk-taking. So we are going to take it as given that there is an asymmetry in risk aversion between the US and the rest of the world. And what it does, it becomes then very simple. If we think about a completely symmetric model of the US versus the rest of the world, and we have a global traded good here, just to start to make things very simple. Everything is symmetric. There's a global traded good, and the only asymmetry is the US is more risk-taking than the rest of the world. What happens in bad states of the world? So in bad states of the world where global output is low, in a complete market environment, what does the planner want? The planner just wants to provide insurance to the most risk-averse player, which is here the rest of the world. So in a complete market environment, if you have an asymmetry in risk aversion between the US, who is more risk-taking, and the rest of the world, the planner is just going to give more consumption to the more risk-averse rest of the world. So that means the US will insure the rest of the world. So you see here that if C, the dark line, is the consumption of the US, the consumption of the US will be smaller in bad states of the world. It's insuring the rest of the world, who is more risk-averse. And then conversely, in good states of the world, it's the opposite. So the US will consume more, and the rest of the world will consume less. Okay, so that's what a planner would want to do because of a different asymmetric concavity in the utility functions. That's going to be the basic building block of the model. So by doing that, you see that we have this insurance property. And how would we implement that with portfolios? Well, again, that would be really easy. Think about it. If you have then the US investing in global equity and leveraging up by issuing safe debt, you exactly implement this type of allocation in this model, because so in bad states of the world, the global equity returns go down. The safe assets gives safe returns. So you have a transfer from the US to the rest of the world. So that's very easy to implement, to decentralize that equilibrium. Now, such a simple model is very insightful, but it's not enough if we want to document or to get all the stylized facts that I've been discussing. So in the paper, what we do is we're interested in exchange rate. So first of all, we have to introduce two goods, and we are going to put a traded and a non-traded good here. There's also a question of size that is interesting. Does it matter that the US is big? Okay, so we are going to introduce differences in size. And we are talking about disaster risk, global crisis. We're not talking about business cycle risk, or we are talking about both, effectively. So we will also introduce a global disaster risk framework in our model, building on Barrow and Ritz. And the question then, also, which is related to something I've been working on extensively, is how do we get this safe haven property of a dollar in a model like that? It's going to be a complete market model with so this asymmetry in coefficient in risk aversion, but we want a bit of action on the safe haven side, okay? And we could go into a very complicated incomplete market model and build some safe haven properties in that, some safe to flight to safety in that, but we are going to do another thing here to keep things very tractable and I think very transparent. We are going to introduce three states of the world: the safe state of the world, the fragile state of the world, and the catastrophic state of the world. And we are going to say, well, when we go from safe to fragile or to catastrophic states of the world, actually risk aversion changes. So people become more anxious. And if people become more anxious, they require more insurance. That creates effectively a flight to safety in a very kind of simple way. And this is very much linked to my work on the global financial cycle, where I show that risk on and risk off are very important to understand the properties of macroeconomic aggregates and financial aggregates around the world. So here my global financial cycle is going to be just modeled by the fact that when we are in a fragile state, the markets become more risk averse, effectively. But we will discipline that in the data. Okay, so that's what the richer model is about. So I'm going to glance over the setup. For those of you who are into that literature, you will recognize many things. I'm not going to discuss that in great detail. The only thing to know is the real exchange rate is determined by the relative price of non-traded and traded goods. We have CRRA preferences both in the US and the rest of the world. We have a traded good, and the size of the countries, the US versus the rest of the world, is parameterized by the coefficient alpha here. You can see that in here. That's the size of a country. There are CRRA preferences, so sigma will be different between the US and the rest of the world. The US is less risk averse than the rest of the world. And on top of that, we allow for changes in sigma. In fragile and catastrophic states, people are more, or will be allowed to be more risk averse. Okay? And this is the consumption bundle, which aggregates traded and non-traded goods. This is the resource constraint for non-traded goods. Markets are complete internationally. We can therefore solve the planner problem, which is shown here. Because of the complete markets, we can solve state by state, and we are going to keep everything very, very tractable and simple. So with complete markets, the marginal utility of consumptions will be proportional, and we are going to be able to discuss risk-sharing properties of the model, which I won't have much time to go into. But essentially, in our model, the risk-sharing properties are represented by this condition here, which is about equating the marginal utility of consumption. If you had separability in the utility function, you would just go back to marginal utility of traded goods being equalized. Here we have non-separability, so you have this additional term which reflects the consumption bundle between traded and non-traded goods. And the way the co-movements between shocks and consumption will go will depend, therefore, on the property of substitutability between traded and non-traded goods. If there are growth substitutes or growth complements, you would change the sign. If they are separable, you go back to simply marginal utility of consumption in traded goods being equalized. Okay. So that's the risk-sharing conditions. We are going to make the assumption, which is a realistic one in the data, that traded and non-traded goods are growth substitutes. And we can derive a bunch of things. We can derive a planner's allocation, which is about all the consumption allocation, which can be solved state by state. We can also derive from the first-order condition the relative price of a non-traded good as a function of the traded goods, which is very neatly, immediately related to the real exchange rate. Okay? And that's going to be this relative price here. It's important. And then the common stochastic discount factor is just given by this formula. Again, if you had non-separability in the utility function, you get rid of that term. You just end up having the growth rate of consumption in traded goods. Okay, so I am going to gloss over this because I don't have time, but we can characterize the planner's allocation fully here. These are the consumption allocation as a function of the underlying parameters and the risk-sharing condition. If output are stationary, we have also stationary consumptions. What is nice is that we've given the complete market assumption here, we can derive very easily the price of any asset in this economy. The price of any asset is going to be given by the dividend plus the expected value of this asset vis-à-vis the stochastic discount factor in the different states. So this ends up being a very simple equation for prices here that we can rewrite in a matrix form. So nothing very mysterious here. We can also use the complete market assumption to derive a very simple formula for wealth in this economy. It's going to be given by this is the consumption in state S, and then the expected value of the wealth over all the future states. So again, we can rewrite a lot of that in matrix form. And importantly, we can also derive a value of current endowments of an economy, so the value of the Lucas trees, both in traded and non-traded goods, with a relative price Q here, using the same type of formula. And in that environment, we can therefore express very neatly the net foreign asset position as the difference between wealth and the value of endowments, which end up in matrix notation taking this form. So very, very simple formula, very kind of beautiful in a way. I don't have time to go much into it, but if you're interested, you can look at it in the paper. It's very compact, it's very easy to manipulate, and it's very intuitive because in complete market, it ends up telling you that your net foreign asset position now is equal to effectively the expected sum of all the future trade surpluses or deficit with the appropriate discount factor. And this is written very neatly in that form. Okay, so now, we therefore can use this entire setup to quantify our model and to see whether we can replicate the stylized facts that I've been talking about, the World Banker balance sheet, exorbitant privilege, exorbitant duty, but also what happens in terms of wealth transfers in bad time, and how does all that depend on the size of the US, for example, the size of the hegemon. Okay? We can do that because we now have a structure which can speak to all of that. A little bit more intuition before I show you the quantified results. If we think about this idea of US bonds are special, so the exorbitant privilege, but only for US safe assets. So what does the model tell us about that? Our model is about risk sharing. So for the US bonds to be special and to give, to be better safe asset, in the case of our model, to give better insurance, you have to have certain co-movements, which are true. They have to provide good insurance in bad states of the world, right? And so they should, if they provide good insurance in bad states of the world, that means that the US interest rate on US assets is going to be smaller than the interest rate on rest of the world safe assets. So we can look at it in a linearized model. So that means in the context of the model where we get rid of the catastrophic shocks, when we focus only on the business cycle risk, we can look at in which cases this is true, that the US bonds, safe bonds, will be a better insurance than the rest of the world bonds. And so when we do that, what we find is that essentially the return on the US bond is going to be smaller than the return on the rest of the world bonds, which means it will be a better safe assets. If this is positive, which means in that term, that co-movement here between the stochastic discount factor and the real exchange rate is positive. And so when is that going to be true? Well, we can derive this condition in that linearized case. And what we find is that this is going to be true, essentially, if most of the shocks that matter in that world are shocks to the domestic non-traded goods. Shocks to the domestic non-traded goods generate a real appreciation in our model and make the US safe assets better from the point of view of insurance than the rest of the world safe assets. So you will have to go through, for the algebra you have to believe me at this point, but you can actually give a sign to this co-movement. You want that in times of global crisis, so relative scarcity, you want real appreciation. This is the conditions that give you that the US has a good safe assets. And this real appreciation happening in times of scarcity happens when the shocks that are dominant are shocks to the US domestic non-traded goods. So this explains that in that literature, in fact, when people assume that the US are almost all the world, the shocks that are dominant are the US non-traded goods shocks, right? If the US is really large in the world economy, that's actually going to be the case. And so US safe assets will actually be providing the better insurance. Now, in the more general case that we have, where, the US is big, but maybe not 90% of the world, and also we have global catastrophic shock, that remains more of a quantitative issue, okay? And this is something that precisely why quantification becomes because interesting and important. So the last thing that we do is that we take our model, we specify output processes, both business cycle shocks and catastrophic shocks, and here we build a lot on Barrow reads. And so a catastrophic shock is essentially a very unusual shock to your consumption, where you're going to have, to your output, where you're going to have a very large drop in output. We can parameterize how large, that's this B parameter, but it's going to happen very infrequently, and we can know exactly how frequently because we can calibrate our safe, fragile, and catastrophic states using some work by Barrow and co-authors. And then we can also calibrate the standard business cycle shocks, which are the epsilon T here and epsilon N, using very standard calibration techniques. And the total stochastic part of our model has therefore two components, the business cycle component and the global shock component, which are the new T here. Okay. So we estimate the model using standard values for a number of parameters, the ones where we don't have much to add to the literature. So we're going to be, for example, the parameter on home bias, the parameter on elasticity of substitution, the collapse in output in disaster time, the recovery rate in crisis times, the probability of fragile and disaster shocks. So we draw on the literature for that. But then we are going to use the simulated method of moment to match the important new things in our model, which are the exorbitant privilege, the exorbitant duty, the appreciation of a real exchange rate in bad times, and then the trade balance, the net foreign asset position, etc., the risk premia, etc. And so we have 10 parameters, 13 moments to match, and we are going to use, so we are going to be minimizing distances, simulated method of moment, in order to see if we can match the data on all these dimensions. So this is what we have been doing. And the good news is that we can match everything pretty well. We are, except the exorbitant privilege, we are under it, for the moment at least. You see that the exorbitant privilege is the first parameter. The target here is, it should be actually, it's 2.8. We are below it, right? So either we are missing something, which could be liquidity, or we can still improve on that, which we probably can. We have to work a little bit harder on this. But the exorbitant duty, so the magnitude of the wealth transfer, the magnitude of the exchange rate appreciation, which are all calibrated on the global financial crisis, and then the trade balance, the risk premia, etc., we kind of get everything then very closely. So so that's how we can match the parameters we're interested in, the moments we're interested in. But then what is very, very interesting is what do we need in order to get these moments? What do we need to get these exorbitant privilege and exorbitant duty? And so here is what we need. The estimated parameters which are the most important for us are these risk aversion parameters. And it's very interesting, and the model actually speaks very strongly on that. In fact, risk aversion in safe times, the asymmetry in risk aversion between the US or the rest of the world in safe times, which you have here, doesn't really matter in safe times. We can have the same coefficient of risk aversion, which comes here close to 1.9, or we could have slightly different ones. It doesn't really matter. It's very flat, the parameter space here. But what we really need to match our moments are that between safe and fragile or safe and disaster, we have an increase in risk aversion. And here this is a delta, so this is really the increase in risk aversion from the risk aversion of safe time, which is higher in the rest of the world than in the US. So what is really key for the model to work is that when we go into fragile times, when we go into catastrophic time, the rest of the world really wants insurance from the US, so that it really becomes more risk averse. The US also becomes more risk averse, but it's really key that the rest of the world becomes more risk averse than the US. And if we have that, then we can pretty much generate everything. So there's a lot of very interesting work by Andrews, Jensko, and Shapiro, which allow us to look really at the robustness of these results, what is important for which results, which parameters are more informative, etc., which we use extensively. And what I've been telling you about the risk aversion parameter is really what counts. So this is really these results here, which are really important. So the increase in risk aversion asymmetric in bad times for the rest of the world compared to the US. All right, so the model is able pretty much to replicate the trade deficit in normal times, the exorbitant privilege, even though not fully quantitatively, but almost there. The exorbitant duty fully, so the insurance payments in bad times, the real appreciation of the dollar in fragile times, and the equity premium is realistic, so we can replicate quite a lot. So then we can use the model and go a bit out of sample. So we can use the model for, the euro area crisis, which is a little bit less intense than Lehman Brothers, but we can use it. We can use it for COVID, etc. Okay, and everything kind of fits. And we can also ask ourselves what happens if the size of the US go down in the world economy. So what does a world with a vanishing hegemon look like? And this is some comparative statistics that we do. And this is what we get for the real safe rate on the US bond. As alpha, which is the size of the US, goes down, you see that the real rate goes down. And this is because the US has to provide insurance to a bigger and bigger world in relative time. So that means the price of that insurance goes up, which means the real rate goes down, okay, in our model. So this is why the real rate goes down. As the hegemon vanishes here. And what happens to the duty, to the valuation changes? Again, if the US becomes very small compared to the rest of the world, it has to provide these insurance payments. That means in terms of GDP, these valuation transfers become very big, and very negative and very big. So this is what you see again. The size of the hegemon goes down. That means that this duty as a percentage of GDP become bigger and bigger. So evidently at some point, it might not be credible that the US is a safe provider of safe assets. But, that's what the model, without incorporating this, that's what the model is saying, right? So that's, yeah. Okay, so let me conclude here to leave 5 minutes for question. So I think the model is able to reproduce the world banker, the exorbitant privilege, the exorbitant duty, the dollar appreciation. The key ingredients for this are these asymmetric risk parameters. And the asymmetry of the risk parameters is very key in the anxious times, in the fragile times, in the catastrophic times, not so much in the safe time. So we need this kind of ingredient of global financial cycle in a way to be able to account for all these facts. And then once we have the structure of a model, we estimate it, then we can do a number of counterfactuals, and we have done a few, but we could do some more, evidently. So let me stop here and see if you have any questions. Sorry for having been a bit quick on a lot of things.
We don't have much time, so let's pick a couple of questions and let's answer in one shot. Okay? So any question? There is in the back, and there's another one.
Thank you so much for a great lecture. Just a super quick question. What specific characteristics of the US economy result in these different risk preferences, like in its utility function? Why is the US less risk averse in the times of financial crisis? Thank you.
The other one?
Santiago Camara from McGill University. I wanted to hear your thought. First of all, thanks for the great presentation. Then I wanted to hear your thoughts about whether this exorbitant privilege is about UST, like the treasuries, or USD. Going forward, especially because even in this conference, we've seen a lot of people doubting the future fiscal path of the US. Well, that might put pressure on UST, but maybe not on USD, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Maybe that's, given time limits.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the two great questions. So what is the kind of micro foundations of the asymmetry in risk aversion? Why is the US? So I think, one really can think about it in two ways. Either a way that is a little bit behavioral, the US has been built with people who tend to be entrepreneurial, the history of the US appealing to this, which maybe I'm not, super enthusiastic about that view, but there would be some, I guess, maybe some support for that by some literature. Or, and I think I'm more sympathetic to the other view, which is that if you have more complete financial markets and better risk sharing within a country, you can write models in which, from the point of view of the aggregate, that's going to be kind of equivalent in reduced form to being more risk-taking. So it's the risk sharing within the US is arguably better historically over that period than the risk sharing in the rest of the world. So especially here, I have a very heterogeneous risk of the world, which is bundled up, right? But I think that would be true for a lot of countries outside the US, that the risk sharing was not as good. And so as a kind of reduced form, you can show in some simple models that this is going to show up as the rest of the world more risk averse. So I would go with that type of thing. On the, the other question, which was about, so sorry, what was it? US dollar versus US treasuries, right. So this is also a very, very important question. So there is some empirical work on this, right? From the point of view, if I try to make this model speak to that. So here, what is really important is the fact that the US is providing some type of assets that the rest of the world uses in a special way, right? They are safe assets, and you could also think maybe there's some liquidity element that we don't have here. And so these safe assets traditionally have been the US treasuries. Now, you could say, maybe looking forward, this is not going to be the US treasuries, but maybe this is still going to be some US dollar assets that are going to be providing the same type of specialness. If this is the case, all of the mechanisms here will kind of still be true in the sense that the liabilities of the US will be especially important for the rest of the world. They will be especially important in crisis times. And this will lead again to this insurance aspect of things, which brings up the dollar, which appreciates the dollar in global crisis times. So the dollar here is a bit special because of these, because of the properties of a subset of these assets, which historically have been the US treasuries. So now the US treasuries could lose some of that, right? And I think, the literature on convenience yields has been showing that the convenience yields have gone down tremendously, in fact, have disappeared, except maybe at some very, very small maturities. But it could be that some other dollar assets substitute, and then the dollar as an exchange rate, will still be special. Or it could be that we move to a very different world in which no dollar assets will be considered to be providing these very non-pecuniary benefits or these insurance benefits, and then the dollar won't be special any longer either, right? So I would really think about that way.
Thank you, Helen, for sharing your wisdom. Thank you. Let me finish here. Thank you.